Oh my goodness, folks, it's happening! It seems like things are looking up for Andretti after all, and there might be some deal between them, General Motors, and Formula One management! It might be over! I mean, I kinda saw it coming, what with all the recent resignations and whatnot, and then the job listings coming up on LinkedIn from Andretti, various sources are reporting, but still, Andretti, 11th team! The language in the last few weeks has certainly changed to that of ever-increasing optimism from the Andretti family's attempts in trying to get into Formula One with a team of their own, instead of doing what was the ideal path for the current 10 teams, and that was to buy one of them out, for a lot of money. Probably a couple of bill. However, this isn't going to be that romantic fairy tale that many people were hoping and thinking was going to happen, where Michael and Mario Andretti would win out against Formula One management, the commercial side of Formula One, and be able to do something that they were hoping to do right from the get-go. Instead, what seemingly is likely to be the case is that many people have had to give up their jobs, many backroom talks have had to be had, as well as guarantors and promises regarding people, as well as many talks about them not losing prize money, the current teams. But still, we might be getting something that is backed by the likes of General Motors and carries the Andretti's name to some extent, but to how much of an extent? That's still a little bit in the grey area at the moment. So Andretti might have won, but at what cost? We'll get into the details of that in a moment, but the breaking part of the story came about from a joint effort from Racing News 365, Associated Press, and Formula.hu, sources which I trust in my research for videos, that stated that talks with the relevant entities, Formula One management and Andretti, were now advancing in a positive direction, and we can maybe see an official announcement coming in the not too distant future. Over the last couple of months, even though it's not been quite enough to make a full video about, there have been various bits and pieces of news that have come out that have made me think that something is happening in the background, and it might have something to do with all of the investigations going on, people moving on from their jobs or retiring altogether, or maybe just pulling back from what they were originally doing. For starters, Michael Andretti, well, he's not the head honcho anymore, and he hasn't been for quite some time, since the end of September. He's stepping back towards a more ambassadorial role. And as for the Liberty Media CEO Greg Maffei, well, he's now the outgoing Liberty Media CEO, whose scathing words back around the Miami Grand Prix sent ripples across the world, in which he told Andretti's father Mario, the 1978 F1 champion by the way, that he would do everything in his power to make sure that Michael would never get his team on the grid ever. So yeah, with him gone and Michael Andretti now stepping back towards some kind of backroom role and some kind of symbolic thing akin to Niki Lauda perhaps, maybe this might mean that talks between the two parties might actually go ahead with no animosity going on or no personal bias. But why was Greg Maffei so serious and determined to make sure Michael Andretti and his team, or whatever he would choose to do, would not so much as race a single lap around a Formula One Grand Prix? Well, it kinda goes back a long time, and it requires a little bit of a history lesson. This is mainly for people who are new to the channel since I made my original videos on the subject. And if you are brand new, by the way, welcome to the channel, by the way. But this history lesson involves Michael Andretti when he was a racing driver for McLaren in 1993. Yes, as Ayrton Senna's teammate. And yes, admittedly, his presence wasn't exactly the most smooth, with him basically not gelling well with McLaren, not performing to the level he and the team expected, and most importantly, he didn't live anywhere near the team's base in Woking. Heck, he didn't even really live in the same country. Apparently, he commuted from America for every single race and for every single team meeting, or if he wasn't there, notes or phone calls would have to be taken to him and to his own home, so it was very, very disruptive. And there were many rumours and reports about him acting really weirdly at race events, but since we didn't have social media at the time, we probably will never know, or it probably just be backroom paddock gossip. But there was a disconnect, and it ultimately broke down, but it did have a silver lining. It gave Mika Hakkinen his call up to McLaren full-time, and subsequently his 2 championships. So yeah, you can imagine that a lot of people that still work in Formula One, or grew up with Formula One and saw what happened with Michael Andretti, were probably incredibly concerned that that same kind of behaviour would happen again if he were running the show. However, he's not running the show anymore. With Andretti Global, he is now taking a backroom role, and instead, his co-owner of the Andretti Global operation, that being Group 1001's Dan Torres, talks are supposedly starting to ramp up again, with him doing all the heavy lifting, as effectively Andretti Global's main owner. For the non-Americans out there, Torres Group's 1001 are the owners of the Gamebridge brand, which adorns many of the Andretti projects, and now he's the effective owner of the entire F1 operation of the storied family. Now that Michael stepped down from that role in any meaningful capacity, this could mean that the entire operation could change from what we expected just 18 months ago. And ultimately, this was a sacrifice that Michael Andretti had to take if he wanted to realize his and his father's dream of getting back into Formula One with their own team. It was clearly not going to be happening with him in charge, so instead, he'd have to give that mantle to somebody else and somebody he trusted. And sure, he's not getting rid of it entirely, and he's still involved in some capacity, but hey, if all is looking good and we might get an announcement in the off-season, we might actually get to see the Andretti name in Formula One after all. And all of that talk and bump over the last couple of years, it'll all be put to rest. And this isn't some kind of flight of fancy or just wanting to make money because F1 is popular. This has been the jewel in the crown of Andretti Global for a very long time. It's partly why, or mostly why, they built that Silverstone facility, to be right next to all of the big brains and big talented people within Formula One, because that's where they live, in the Midlands of England. And that makes sense to have a big base there, and they hope to have everything under one roof. You've only got to look at what they're doing in Formula E and realise that they are taking things seriously, and they can actually produce some success. So I wouldn't be surprised in Formula One in a few years' time, they might end up outdoing what Audi are capable of doing. But still, despite the changes in leadership in the last few weeks, the odds of the team realising their goals were looking incredibly slim. What with the likes of the FIA president Ben Sulayem seemingly walking back his original gusto for them securing an 11th slot on the grid, which by the way the current Concord agreement does allow, as well as another team to boot, so we might even see a 12th one, to then him actually joining sides with F1's commercial boss Stefano Domenicali and recommending them buy out an existing team instead, or maybe reconsider the arrangement the team had with General Motors, or better yet, have General Motors come in on their own, since they are an American brand and they bring in a lot of money. And in my honest opinion, I think a lot of the teams, as well as the people who own Formula One, would have really loved that extra storyline of having General Motors and Ford in the same competition, two of the biggest American car brands out there, nay the entire world, having General Motors backing with Andretti or whatever it'll be called Cadillac against Red Bull Ford powertrains. Sure, Red Bull Ford might have the advantage to begin with, but everything's going to be completely thrown into whack in 2026. Who knows who might be at the front? It does make for a compelling narrative, but the teams were vocally opposing this move for a long time for fear of losing out on prize money and the allure of the sport being compromised after they themselves weathered the storm of 2020 and came out of it richer than ever. However, according to an article from the Washington Post, both Toto Wolff and Fred Vasseur have walked back their earlier criticism and yet aren't also openly supportive. Basically, what you can tell from Vasseur and Wolff, two of the most influential team principals out there for Ferrari and Mercedes, they're basically going, you know what, we don't really have an opinion on it, it's out of our hands now, it's between Formula One, the FIA, Andretti, whatever, we'll just see what happens and go forward from there. And that is a really major climb down, considering not all that long ago, all of the team principals had something to say about why Andretti shouldn't be in the sport. Even Zach Brown was a little bit cautious about what could be expected. And especially James Vowles, he really hated the idea of Andretti being in the sport. But no, I guess now team principals have just gone into the sulking phase of the situation where they're just like, fine, it doesn't really matter what we say anyway. It's going to happen no matter what we do. Fine, okay, well, we don't have an opinion. Yeah. I call this the sulking phase. But this is a really interesting turn of events, especially considering that the European courts recently shut down their investigation into the matter and seeing whether or not there was cartel-like behaviour going on with the F1 teams and Liberty Media in shutting Andretti out. But the European Commission, they couldn't come up with a decision, mainly because they just simply couldn't. As in, they couldn't tell whether or not there was something going on behind the scenes. But they did leave the door open in case something came about which could easily change the story altogether. But that isn't the most important decision going on, and many people will be thinking, it's a European Commission, and there are European teams in there, of course they're going to be siding with the F1 team. But then let's not forget the Department of Justice investigation that's been going on for many months now, as well as many US senators and Congress people getting involved as well, with Mario Andretti pulling off that blinder of getting all of these politicians to work together, a bipartisan effort which is incredibly rare these days, as you probably know. And Liberty Media don't just have that F1 inquiry to deal with, they've also got the Live Nation one against ticketing and scamming and stuff like that. But whether or not the matter will be dropped before the change in presidency in a couple of months, that remains to be seen. But it seems like that might not be needed, what with Greg Maffei stepping down as Liberty's leader. So you know what? It kind of just makes me think that that really lengthy statement from Formula One detailing all of the bullet points as to why Andretti couldn't and shouldn't be in Formula One, that was all completely bunk. And instead, this ultimately boils down to two angry old men fighting each other and having a bit of an argy-bargy, and thusly nothing could get salted. And isn't that pretty much summing up most arguments and things not going ahead? Seriously, Michael Andretti, Greg Maffei, it was beef between them, and that is incredibly sad because this could have been really, really cool, but all it did was just sour the taste of the situation in everybody's mouths. One man had a gripe with another man, and that was enough to pull as many strings as possible to make sure that that man he didn't like and didn't want near his beloved Formula One, and thusly he allowed his personal feelings to get the better of him, even if it brought the kind of attention that business executives would never wish to land on their desks. You know, litigation. I also bet that he didn't see Mario Andretti pulling off what he was able to pull off, and again, that was spectacular and very public. Considering that Formula One really wants to be popular in America again and continue to be popular for years to come, railing and protesting against one of American motorsport's most storied brands, and one that is based at the heart of American motorsport in Indiana, that is completely ludicrous. It completely just goes against everything that they were hoping to do in America, and it just makes it all about the money. And yes, of course, it is always about the money, but surely they would at least want to put some kind of veil up just to make it look like there is some heritage going on here or respecting of tradition. But anyway, it seems like the two angry old men are now backing off from proceedings, and we're now getting two other angry old men recusing themselves from any discussion on the matter. The team principals no longer having any strong feelings about the matter, and that's really weird considering Toto owns part of Mercedes F1 team, and its valuation matters to him more than any other team boss. That is quite telling, and it pretty much justifies all of the stuff that Andretti have been talking about, what with their preparations for 2026, all of that stuff about getting access to the Toyota Cologne wind tunnel that now they share with Haas, all the stuff they've been making with their Silverstone factory, the fact that they've been saying that they will have a fully functional chassis by the end of this year in terms of 2026. They still continued, as they've said many times, at pace. That was incredibly ballsy, and many people thought that that was wishful thinking, and that maybe this was just an exercise of wasted time and money and resources and getting people's hopes up in all of the people that they've been hiring, because Andretti's workforce for the Formula One project, alongside General Motors, it's coming up to like 250 people, and that's not that far off some of the smaller teams. So not too long from now, if they get this go-ahead, I wouldn't be surprised if they suddenly get more people being hired for that entire initiative. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are performance engineer and race engineers roles being asked for and open to apply on LinkedIn. So if you're a budding race or performance engineer, well, you know where to go. Get yourself on LinkedIn. But speaking of that chassis prototype ready for the end of this year by Christmas, I think what could be really interesting is that since they're not on the FIA F1 entry list, nor are they going to be bound by the rules per se, yet they do have access to the information via the FIA since they've already been greenlit for 2026, doesn't this mean that they can pretty much develop the car without any restrictions whatsoever, so long as they have the capital and resources and expertise to do so? Which they do have. So that means, I think by the time we get to New Year's Day 2025, when all of the other teams can actually start and resume all of development for 2026's car, Andretti might not be that far behind, because they have a practical working chassis by then. This is really, really interesting. And all of the blowback and resistance from the teams by then just completely rejecting Andretti, but Andretti continue anyway, this might come back to bite these teams, and Andretti will feel incredibly vindicated. Because when Audi arrives in 2026, they are still bound by the rules because they bought out an existing team, that being Sauber, and thusly, they're reined in by the New Year's Day embargo. But that being said, the Andretti brand that we're going to be seeing in F1, it's a completely different beast to what we saw at the beginning of 2023, when they opened discussions with the FIA regarding the expression of interest, what they're bringing to the negotiation table right now. And right now, we're not exactly sure what kind of a role the Andretti family will have in this adventure. Will the Andretti brand even still exist by the time we get to 2026? What kind of backroom negotiations are there taking place right now, which might be saying, okay, you can get that team going, but you cannot have the Andretti name on board whatsoever. You're going to have to come up with something else. And considering that Dan Torres owns Group 1001, is this going to be involving Team Gamebridge Cadillac or something like that? The Andretti name not featuring at all, maybe some kind of badging exercise maybe. So that means it is essentially Gamebridge team, but with Andretti badges to make it look somewhat authentic or something, with just Mario and Michael being wheeled out for promotional and press events or something like that to go, yeah, this team's fantastic. Meaning they don't actually have any technical or direct involvement whatsoever. They're just there for branding? We don't know. These are all the discussions that are taking place at the moment behind closed doors. But I personally think that the Andretti name will live on because it is a representable brand. And even Christian Horner, when all of these talks were red hot, was saying that Andretti was a really reputable name in American motorsport. But they just simply were towing the line with everybody else, saying it could impact Formula One. So it was really mixed messages from Christian Horner in particular. But right now, I think it is looking good that we are going to be getting an 11th team. And I think that tourists would be more shrewd than just ditching the Andretti name altogether, because we've got to look to what Dolphin Capital is doing with their handling of the Williams team. Them recognising completely the importance of that team's name and heritage, and recognition amongst international motorsport audiences, especially now. So that's why Williams basically has remained the same, and James Vowles has been allowed to do whatever he wants without any risk of impacting or angering the investors, embracing the history of Williams. So what I personally reckon is that yes, Michael Andretti will have some kind of involvement, but I don't think he'll have any executive power or something like that. That is probably going to be coming from Dan Torres. But then again, considering that they worked together on the IndyCar initiative, I'm pretty sure that Torres may be acting as some kind of front for Andretti, him basically pushing the buttons at the behest of Michael Andretti, the person who was originally in charge of the Andretti global operation. But we don't know that for sure. But they've worked together for quite a few years now, and it's brought them some success with Andretti in IndyCar, so who's to say that the same thing and arrangement might be happening in Formula One as well? And let's not forget that all of the people they're bringing on board, these are not people who are complete newbies to Formula One like Toyota were back in 2002, save for maybe Mike Gascoigne or something like that, or a few others. No, they've got some really storied names, Andretti, already, with Pat Simmons as a consultant coming out of semi-retirement. And then we got to remember what Otmar Safnauer was saying, and has been saying quite a few times, that if Andretti gets on the Formula One grid, he'd be more than happy to become their team principal. And let's not forget, even though Otmar Safnauer has not brought major silverware to the teams that he's raced at, he's certainly built very solid and reliable and dependent teams that could maybe be built into something that could outperform the facilities that they have. I mean, we've got to remember, Force India, they were getting so many podiums with him around, and you can't discredit Safnauer, even though it didn't work out at Alpine. I think it could work out at Andretti. So with this in mind, the odds of the team getting what they wanted are much higher than they were at the start of this year, when the composition of the team was entirely different to what it is now, and the Liberty Media leadership, which is now embarking on a complete rejigging itself, were locked in a personal feud which only served to leave a sour taste in everybody's mouths, and bring the eye of litigation toward the sport, which is completely not ideal. This probably might be a situation where both parties don't want this to escalate any further with the Department of Justice. It might be ultimately turned away when the presidency changes in January, and we might be just seeing some sort of compromise, that maybe they both realise that their own personalities were getting the better of the situation, and that logistically and in terms of financial success, it could actually be really beneficial. And maybe those were the two sticking points, and without them in the room, we might actually get somewhere and have an 11th team after all, albeit with some changes and conditions and compromises, which is to be expected from the commercial side of things. Because come on, having an 11th team in Formula One, that's not a bad thing. It's only a good thing, because you've got another team in the mix, and it's an American team at that, a real American team. More American eyes will be interested in watching Formula One if they've only seen it in passing and have not been interested because it didn't appeal to them. But IndyCar fans, they might look to Formula One a little bit more seriously if Andretti are there as well. And who knows, we might actually see more prize money being added. Formula One might become even more valuable. There are a lot more positives here than you might think. And I bet you that Papa Stroll will be really happy at the idea of there being 2 more drivers in Formula One, so that means people will be looking at Lance Stroll with far less scrutiny. From the looks of it, if this all goes through, Andretti's prominence will be less than it was when the FIA initially made their call for applications. Yes, their money built the factories and whatnot, but the 2 men who carry that name will be there to act as promoters for the team, and to justify the name being there still. It's Group 1001's owner who will be pulling the strings at the top now, as well as General Motors taking on more of a role in how the team operates and expands to prepare itself for entry in 2026. Which is looking likely to be the case, but then there's the question of who is going to be providing them power units. Well, this is by my own little theory. After what's been going on with Renault and them dropping the Vidy Châtillon arm, they're not making power units anymore. We got 300 people working there, and they apparently on the dyno, they had some really promising information. And there were rumours and rumblings I was seeing on social media that Chevrolet, by proxy General Motors, might be looking at buying that armoured V Chatillon and maybe using it to their own ends for some sort of motorsporting campaign, not necessarily Formula One. But if they did choose to use it for Formula One, that's effectively a turnkey deal. You've got hundreds of people who know all about the new regulations, they've been building a power unit, and they absolutely know everything to go alongside what General Motors already knows and what they've been working on. Put those two together, you might come up with a Cadillac branded engine that might be really appealing and actually might get some customers when they become available for general purchase from other teams come 2028. That'll be really, really interesting. And what would the branding be? That'd be really interesting. Would it be indeed Team Gamebridge Andretti Cadillac, perhaps? We might certainly see either bright yellow or bright pink or something like that. It would certainly make for a really interesting looking livery. And if it is bright pink, then I think BWT Alpine, or whatever they're going to be calling themselves in 2026, they might have some words. 2 pink teams. Ooh, they'd be tickle pink. But in my eyes, this is all akin to the famous meme of, oh yeah, it's all coming together. And all it took was for 2 old men to stop fighting each other. And hopefully this deal will get across the line. And then we can start talking about who might drive for them in earnest and with excitement when they arrive in F1. Although I think a lot of people would want Daniel Ricciardo back in there, but I think he's done with Formula 1 now for good at this point. Which is what I think the FI would hope would be the case for its ever-brewing storm with the drivers currently, and their communications with George Russell at the helm. To find out why I think this is only going to get worse should the FIA precedent continue to ignore the matter and just continue to do whatever they're doing, go and watch this video next, straight after this one.